like some substitute. Zogi and Nima Karma Dawala Soba and Chugi, Nujin Lasra, Nisha, Nasra, Teta Semada, Tezoyan, you also do a realize Geshema. Oti Anzugi, Petting Anzugi, and Melona and Zuni Disra, ni Don Korangla Pachudo Nasra, Don Imbala Shendonas, and Dharamshala, Anzugi, Dawa Gamala Soba, Chuna Zuni Chanasra, Dawa Gamala, Zuni di Dawa Gama Imbala Shenasra, Anzugi, the Badu Zimbagi Zindajura, or Titaranchiba Relati, Tibarala, Anzugi, Melonagi, Zuni Dagarla Sobi, Zuni, Chuna Share di Sebuji Chamas Scholar.
세상 단ang 가서 변한 가서 주인 and 시골 타운도 가라라. 파기 가서 차주디 가서 동바래来말아. 와. 동바 쟁겨 말레스. 다 당하나 단다디 칼로스나. 계시든 제마이나 그 뎀바 제바로 차려라. 가서 추이디 뭐. 내가 가서 오늘 뭐에 있을 가서 미 담에 빠지나 로저 메니지나 파기 동바디 차리지도 동바래来말아. 근데 가서 찍으라서. 와. 다이네야 단다 다가나시기 단다 가서 추나로라 아니 다웨기 주니 샤디지디야 라 다와다 까마 주니 샤주디 파기 주니디 마레라고 말하데 마레스 라워 대단 드라와나시기 간조 그치 천이 주비 뭐보도 줘야 대단 드라와 추나게 주니 샤와 나신기 담버트고요 말라워다 타니디 요 말을 치비터 말이라 담버트 빼나 가서 딜 간조 샤게 요래 간조 미를 샤 디기 마타 마치비스네 요라 라 내가 진이도 열 들으려고 말해. 당한저기 디 파킹올라 뎀버트버치 두사야다. 아니 추나로라 다와다 아니 까마게 주니디 뎀버트번 잠바니디 치버로 셔기레스. 근데 이 용을 아니 요 말레스. 메바지랑 아주 도타는 제 잠바테다 디 뎀버트버 용을 수투바지 메발랑 아주 요반 잠바테다 추나게 다와다 까마도 추나게 다와다 까마 오늘 메바다 먼저 인반 잠바니디 총바를 해라.
So now, first we need to look at the example of the reflection of our face in the mirror. And when we are asked to reflect on the manner in which this reflection in the face, of the face in the mirror, if we conceive it to be an actual face, then we are, because it appears as our face, there's the appearance of the reflection, which resembles our face. Yes? So when we are told to reflect on the reflection, then we are essentially being instructed to reflect on appearances. Okay? So now, rather than using the term appearance, we first look at whether the reflection itself is the actual face or not. Yes? Okay? Now if you say that the reflection itself is the actual face, then that's completely in contradiction with reality. Yes, because that's not the actual face at all. This we understand. So even though it appears to be the face, resembles the face, it's not the actual face at all. This we understand. Now we come back to our discussion about how things do not appear as it exists. How things do not exist as they appear. Okay? How does it appear to us as having some objective existence, intrinsic existence? But we become attached to that appearance. We fail to investigate the nature of that appearance. Right? Whether our minds become mistaken with regards to the appearance itself or with regards to reality itself. That's the question. Yes? Now when we use the example of the sun, moon, and so forth, we go back to the reflection of our face. Now when we look at our face, reflection of the face in the mirror, can you begin to discern specific characteristics of the face on the reflection?
Yes.
Yes, that's signs and characteristics. But it's just an appearance. Yes? So similarly, now we come back to the root text itself. The sun, the stars, the moon, when it perfectly reflects, it appears in a still water.
Yeah.
Yes? If we misconceive that reflection itself as the sun and moon, then that's a misconception. And so similarly, the manner in which objects appear to our mind, we misconceive that appearance to be reality itself.
나와 다가랑 아니 된담라 나서기 나와 다가랑 아니 된담하기 내로라 신도요.
Yeah, Shiba. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question. Talking about this Dharmadatu, how can one know it has a Buddha nature?
Kam de shishi wi ningbo la jora, sanje ji rongshin, sanje ji rik, manso ju la yore la jora. Tina nyeba do khande nyeba ro wes. Nyeba den la jora.
상제기 기당 간주 다 딜라 로라 티다 간주 셰바들 장니야 페도 기당 간주 셰발라는 그 통해 민두데 간주 그 장 안데 진리 리파 타메 데야 페도에도 세르 모두 봐 마시바 얘는 간주 진주가 개코지 신기 매바 있나 보고 가라라 근데 간주 장 세리 장네 베장네 지 장네 간주 세차지 뭐 로야지도 봐 진데디 간주 셰발라야디 디샤고다 천이나로 쉬어야나 야 시바야 탐이돼야 패도해 그래서 배나 착바도 눈줄로도 쇼지야 셀게버 로토예요 말라고 지당로 마rum발로 두자레데 야 패니 코베 간데 쿠니로 야가다 두아니데 쿠니 덴데로 쳐나 콜야 탐이돼야 줘야 그래서 봐 덴데 로로 받들래 그체 체진지마도 야 간라 로토 말라 해지요 봐 다음에는 가서 단다 코 가서 카데오심 힘보다 어디 간데서 하고 올라 말해
Nyeba khande nyeba wes. Yore la nyeba chi nyeba ro asa.
nyeba ji nyewa la pena ta ngazo sanjegi ra sanjegi ngazo khande ha kugudula na sanjegi sore de apoch lo ina ra tanda da seri gi to ngazo taji che re pena ngazo dithare du chama taji chini ani konzo ge dinde de dinde ma la gi suwara sanjegi nyema ne ngazo gi jig de jenda joa na ro ta ji mambu ji sun sha ra ti tanda ta odi gala ta thu de ni ro chagera 디디 gala 가서는 거기 남주에디 nyemani 하고 차야지 봐 지난게 산제 중요단들로 이동 두절하지 도사라 봐 nyema 숨샤주기 근데 산제 변 두니스바 밤바디 줄래 타임니로 아니 근데 산제 샤주기 강사기 숨디 단대기 두들에 세리 근데 예지 도사라 단도 군이를 템비차 nyem을 고숨사라 디 가르실라 코라 따사데 근데 요마라 니 코라 산다 근데 로 공부 한 도서디 시den지 라 디간지 지기 하고다
Now, when we say how exactly do we come to a conviction about the fact that the Buddha nature resides in all of us, how do we become certain of this? Now, first, rather than looking at the Buddha nature itself, it is important to appreciate the nature of consciousness itself. Right? So, when we look at our consciousness, then we do realize that consciousness can be trained, consciousness can be developed. Now, herein, when we are talking about developed, trained, we are talking about the clarity of consciousness. And this is true, just relate this to our own experiences. Since we are a child, up to the moment now, we have grown up to be an adult. Then have our consciousness developed over the course? Yes. Clarity, stability, yes. So this is the manner in which consciousness can be developed, can be trained in a sense. So these qualities of the clarity, stability of consciousness can effectively be trained, and as such, from a Buddhist perspective, we say that this basic quality of consciousness, clarity and stability, it is boundless in its nature. That there is no limit to its capacity, its scope, as opposed to the afflictions, obscurations, which defile it, which cover it. Because when we look at the afflictions, they are very limited in its scope, even though they are powerful, but they only begin to function up to a certain point. But the true nature of consciousness is boundless. This we need to appreciate first. Yes? And now if we really are to gain some conviction about the Buddha nature residing in all of us, then it is important to look at the teachings of the Buddha himself, who said that all of us have within us the Buddha nature. And we look at that enlightened being as someone who has actualized that Buddha nature. And someone who has actualized that Buddha nature repeatedly stresses that all sentient beings have within them the Buddha nature. So now, if we are to take him for his word, that doesn't really make sense. So we look at his other teachings, which make sense. So, for example, it's been 2,600 years already since the Buddha came into this world and passed away from this world. But his teachings still continue to be relevant, not just with our lived experiences, but even scientifically. In this day and age, science have developed already to cut through subatomic particles to looking for objective reality. And their conclusion, even though at this point it's not that conclusive, but their conclusion at this point seems to agree with what the Buddha said 1,000 years ago, that there is no such thing called objective reality, that it's all interdependence. So when we look at an example of quantum findings in this day and age, when they talk about the double slit experiment, how the subjective subject itself affects the object, how two different subjects looking at the same object from a very gross level perceives it differently, but similarly on the object itself at a subatomic level, there is a difference between someone observing it and someone not observing it. So this points to the fact how the Buddha 1,000 years ago talked about how there is not even a particle of objective reality, not even a particle of inherent existence. Because inherent existence will entail that there is a manner in which things exist apart from our own experience of the mind perceiving it. So when we look at this kind of scientific findings and the teachings and how they correlate, then we can begin to understand that what the Buddha taught was not something meaningless. It's an enduring truth. So by gaining conviction about his teachings, then we can begin to gain a conviction about the Buddha nature that he says resides in all of us.
It's meditating on emptiness, for example, when the self dissolves, and there's you can't find the self, and you're like in this experience of you can't find the self, I guess, in the experience of emptiness. Is that space, is that like a part of the Buddha nature?
No, not in Buddhism. Many masters stresses the importance of understanding the selflessness of the self or the person first,
Yeah.
and then begin to meditate on selflessness of phenomena.
Yeah.
Yes.
당한조 이딜라 걸 거기 한조 기시 다음에 봐라야들 또 동반이라 간사랑은 마두바라야들 곰자나스라 갑드드 점바니 간사랑은 마두베다 니바도 지냐나 곰지 주네라 아니 갑드드 점바니 한조기 아니 한조 감데시시비 닝고라죠라 디다 똑스러지 고츠용 거라야스라
간사
동니고로 곰자니 점바라 아니 간사랑은 마두바 다 아니 데바르 마두바 Delane Gomja and Muzambata, Kansa de Barmaduba, Dharamuna Madubala, Nibado, Tisnianas, Cut to this mining until you come the ship in Nimbo, Sanji Rick Lajura, Tinganzuki Julada, Tismoying. The Dilla Manzo in Della Gera, Kansaki Dame Chipola, sometime. Tango, Chuji Dame, any Matongwini, Kansaki Dame Tamboto, Kansaki Dame, that toss on some Nasra, then it Teda with Haran Chebati. 취지 담을 받고 rim바도 당디스
네. 지당가 저기 시글로기 주나도 이래다. 가시겠다. 배는 가서 동반이를 지금 가르편도에 내주라. 동상지 백일 중위를 두버지 매박 학원에 가르편도에 열려나. 동반이를 남서 시를 하지 말이라. 딘데 배는 가서 지금 알아서를 때 지금 니만니만 대두 망부 질리기도. 그라. 뒤에 주도체 그 그 템부 요라 데 ngazo thani de shabe jujen dinde jile ten chungwe yo hako tatel ten hako de la dinde we ani jujen de phaga dona phage par chige jujen de kharla na chi ngazo desha shedan khondo ra so de ngazo para lo marungwa de jule ten chungwe yo ra wanda lo marungwa de chungwe yo na dinde lo marungwa de panga yo re yo ma te epe to kora pe dinde lo marungwa de be chue mejo ma takpa tembo dinde jirela na ma memba dinde jako te memba hago de ko phagi demba memba hago ko de ngazo tanda bodo ko de chama chige gogo tang de ni rojo dinde jila ngazo demba mai ba jila ngazo tu de ji ba hago de ne tong ni la ba kwa cha dinde jin zare sam.
So our meditation on emptiness should not simply be an intellectual exercise. So it is important first to approach meditation of emptiness in this manner. We first need to look at our suffering and our experience of pain, pleasure, suffering, happiness, and so forth. Now, when we begin to look at our experiences of pain, pleasure, and suffering and happiness, then we do understand and we do appreciate the fact that we are more concerned about overcoming our suffering. This is true. We want to overcome our suffering. We don't want to experience suffering. Now, if the suffering itself is causeless, then we cannot really help it. But it should come from the understanding that suffering itself is not causeless. It indeed has a causes and conditions. Now, we are looking at these causes and conditions first, our suffering. And these causes and conditions are not, suffering is not causeless because they have causes and conditions. And then when we look at the causes and conditions, we begin to understand that these causes and conditions in themselves are depending arising. They are not intrinsically existent causes. They are not absolute causes as such themselves. Yes? And now when we begin to understand this, then we look at the manner in which these causes manifest themselves in our attitude and behavior in the form of afflictions. So this is exactly what we need to tackle through our meditation on emptiness. That the afflictions, when they do arise within our mind stream, conditions our actions. And then the affliction which conditions our actions brings us suffering. So now we begin to also look carefully at the afflictions and realize that they are not intrinsically existent. So as such, they can be overcome. They are dependent arising. If we address this, then they can be overcome. And in its place, we can cultivate positive qualities of the mind. So that is in effect the task or the purpose of meditating on emptiness, to overcome the afflictions.
Just about this, so we are meditating on emptiness. That's one aspect. But how we are going about it is we are thinking about causes and conditions, seeing how they are inherently empty, and then we are seeing its impact on our behavior and attitudes. But so one of the most common things that we can see on day-to-day basis is our behavior itself, right? Which has particular cause, especially in interpersonal relationships, right? We behave in a certain way, but we are able to, if the one is able to understand where that behavior is coming from, right? Like in psychology, most of the time they talk about childhood trauma, right? So you're able to understand that, okay, I'm doing this because this happened, that gave me a feeling or an emotion of this XYZ, whatever it is. So you're able to understand all of this, right? You might also be able to bring in the impermanent factor that, okay, these feelings which I'm feeling or these emotions which I'm experiencing, they might not be there tomorrow. But as you have also mentioned, Buddhism doesn't negate that experience itself, right? But at the same time, we are also saying that it is inherently empty. But that feeling is very much real, right? The pain in the body is real.
Inherently empty of what?
Like it doesn't have an intrinsic value. The suffering,
Exactly.
it does not have an intrinsic value. So on an
Not
intellectual
value, intrinsic existence.
So on an intellectual level, it might make sense. Like you can bring in these concepts, right, as a way of again an analysis. But that feeling in your body, that rush of thoughts, those still exist. So now the question itself begins is that how should one analyze their behaviors, right? So that the emotion and thoughts that are accompanying that, right? So that cycle of thought, emotion, and behavior, it gets lost, or not lost, but it is still, you're still able to not suffer in those emotions and
I don't get
thoughts.
it. I don't understand.
Okay. Behavior is causing you thoughts, it's causing you emotions. That is causing you physical pain also, because emotions do tend to bring that tightness in your body. So on a thought level, you're able to understand it, right? You're able to give explanations to it. Same way you're also able to behave, right? But at the same time, in your emotional side, it is still heavy. And because your emotional side is still heavy, the discursive thought still exists, your body is also in a very discomfort or dysregulated state, right? So
And the question?
how does one how does one break this web of analysis, behaviors, at the same time be able to be coherent with it?
Tako itiwa titigir. Nganzogi da tongma nyi la ne nganzogi ne sungyo resra. Ne tso di nganzogi ne soso gi dungye gi ju ra. Ne le da nyumo yimba ra. Ne le da nyumo yimba la ta yin zama nyumo di ya denpa duba ma yimba. Nangwa ne duba ma yimba. Tende ji yin zama jujen la tene chungyo ba. Jujen la tene chungyo na nganzogi jujen de zo dortu nasra. Nyumo dortu gyo ba. Tende nganzogi da nganzogi chik. Samlo tang na tangsa ji yo resra. Yina nganzogi da nyongwa ji yo ra. nyongwa di susu la kanyi chi te yundu zamba nyongwa ji yungu res, semsor chi yungu ras. Yena ya, tidu zamba samla tanga dinda tuzu ragi ma ras ta, chik tongpa nyi re, denbar ma duwa re, utaba re la samla chi yungu ma ras. Tema tha dolam san semsor ro shukchimbo chi chena, chik le duwa ra, chawa tsam duwa ras. Ani samla ya tena shin tha arang pusu dobo di ko yungu ras. Cheza ani nanzu ki ta te dawa ya ni chik kor de jo ra tha arang. Semsor chichung, semsor tela tene nyumon chiche, nyumon tela tene semsor chichung, semsor tela tene chawa chitsam ra. Tende do ta kora jadi ra, dubu nyong di dos. Tende we dubu ki ta nyong de khor de jo ra. Di ganzu kandes di chogres. Dongle chogres.
Chesa re, ta tanda ganzu chinang ge sunje chiju la dewan deba, dunge mu deba chiba yinba che. Dewan deba ina dewe judu mahi, ra. Dunge mu deba ina dunge ju takpa ganzu dunge gi judu kala do sha sheda timu du wan judu wan di shor ra dewe gi juji gi de chi phun so ba gi judu yang ta ba du ma shin wan dunge gi ra pena ji zawa ji dewan de jan timu be dunge ni la ngoba jus ra de ka sana ra gi dewa da tan jom do re la ji ra che tang gan dunge di chungo re dunge la sa ga ni yo ma ra yine ya dunge di mande na ti judi ha ma go ni ani ga zo ti chi go ra 되게 줄은 아주 주사대 와. 근데 인자 아니 강이 양스 테데 데리오라. 다디 어느 동해지 중국에나 동해를 샤스. 다디 동해들이 이나 어느 데데 동해들 주데 chen 같은 아주 배지 중국에 내가 질 마순 디 쉬인 섬스라. 근데 동해지 레게나 동해디 가네 레게도 와. 되게 주데 chen 가르래도. 대바 까야 두에 민도. 따야죠. 지상 산지기 담보는 주고 덴버시기 주고 거기 디르도. pena nga zu dungye de ma tambo sung ra mi khashi ge sung or sa chi chu tambo dungye khar sin sung ina la ja dungye de nga zu nyo chega na chi dungye la so pa ta nga chi ju dungye cha pa chi mambu jo ra dungye de nga zu nyo le sa da nyo yin de ga la ani tambo dungye res dungye de ra te ra ta ona dungye ye wa ina dungye di josa gi ju khar re dos dungye re sha la ne semba du de ne pheng mara dungye de khane le gi du ta wa ina tinda cha chi ta yu de ga la konjung 지난게 준대기 차네는 담보 건주지 아니 동해리고 이네 디마순 전에 담보 데부도 순샤 라 데부 동해 데부 동해 들리는 디 주도 chen 카레에서 건주이 바하고 라 원나 건주 레샤다 동해 참아 중서 주디 건주 레샤사 대참지 디고 말에 동해란지 레데고 원나 다티 건주디 바까야 두에 민도 근데 동해 건 중서기 시디 까지 연이지레다 매주지레다 제바체오다라 아니 고발라데 바까와라 집어라 근데 고바더니요 원나 까야 예바지 하고나 원나 칸데스까오 까야 탐랑 가르도 라 탐랑 가르도 아니 남데 세상 어디야 동네데마 건주데마 고베데마 남지데마 덴바시 순다 되네라 라
So for this, now In the classical Buddhist scriptures, they make this point that even though we are all equal in wanting happiness and not wanting suffering, but the manner in which we live our lives is even when we do desire happiness, we are not able to accumulate the causes of happiness. We are not able to achieve the causes of happiness. But even though we do not want suffering, we actively accumulate and run after the causes of suffering. Yes? Even though we do not desire suffering, we actively run after the causes of suffering. Then similarly, another point that is being made is that even though we do not want suffering, out of ignorance, it almost looks as if all we aspire is for suffering. Out of ignorance, the manner in which we live our lives is, it almost looks as if we aspire to suffer. Yes? Now when we look at so when we look at this kind of verses, when it says, even though we do desire happiness, we are not able to achieve the causes of happiness. Even though we do not desire suffering, we actively run after the causes of suffering. Even when we do not desire suffering, out of ignorance, we live our lives as suffering is the only thing we aspire for. Now herein, when we look at it carefully, if we fail to recognize suffering for what it is, then we will always destroy our own causes of happiness. Yes? Because we will keep running after suffering, looking for happiness in a place where there is no happiness at all. So now, if we are to make sense of this, we need to look at the Buddha's first teaching, the Four Noble Truths, and the manner in which the Buddha presented the Four Noble Truths. So the Buddha took care to present it in this manner, that he taught about the truth of suffering first, rather than the truth of origin of suffering. Because when we look at our lived experience, we can all appreciate that it is marked by suffering. So as such, it is easy to immediately relate to it when we are introduced to suffering. Because if we look at the causal progression of the Four Noble Truths, then it should be that the origin of suffering should come first. But that's not the manner in which the Buddha presents it. The Buddha advises us first to recognize the truth of suffering itself.
The nature of.
Yes. So when we say truth of suffering, we are taught how to recognize suffering for what it is. And now when we are able to recognize that indeed this is what suffering is, then we begin to investigate whether this suffering is causeless or not. And then we come to realize that indeed our suffering is not causeless. Our suffering has a cause. And then we are investigating the origin of our suffering. And when we begin to investigate the origin of suffering, we begin to realize that at its most gross form, it comes from our actions. But when we begin to look at our actions carefully, they are conditioned invariably by our emotions, negative emotions. Now, when we begin to realize that this is the cause of our suffering, this is the origin of our suffering, now we have to now effectively look at whether we can overcome these causes. Yes? Overcome our negative behavior, harmful behavior, overcome our negative emotions, disturbing emotions. Then, when we come to realize that these negative emotions and these negative behavior in themselves depend upon causes and conditions, then we do realize that indeed it can be overcome. So that's the truth of cessation, coming to the realization that this cause of suffering can be overcome. And now when we come to the realization that this cause of suffering can be overcome, now we have to look for effective means to overcome it. Right? We have to walk through our problems now, so to say. So then that's the method, that's the Dharma, the path, the spiritual path itself.
pena ngazo la miji gi chirang la chi mera ro tawai na ngazo di chogum da khasna nga la de la pe tora go ya ra an chirang la chi dungde ro tam da yin ba ra ndi chawa da ngala gogum da ra ta pena kanji nganzo khara shina kanji mi khajin sosu suncha shibu zo ra tam hin ra ro jina sosu lo gogo de mera ro do gogo mare ani khari ne chi kangi khari sosu din ye de ta ngazo pena ngala chi glason la di ngadi na doa nganzo la chi glason nganzo la chi dongso nganzo la ta ya ko chuma nganzo la chi tre ma so nganzo la di gale ngadi na yor ra tende inza nganzo la ya po chi himdu ngadi na doa khadi na kangi tesa sama de na ngazu de ra tende fa cha che dang de gale ani rang de sunche shimbo shibu ji che mu de gale ani kangi mambu chi den le onda ra ta pena ngazo gi chi ta tanda lamsa khatu do toni tu tu ma de kangi kharu musa chama di pai susu samba na she mai ke ngaran zo nam to go do ta ba ha khona te chi daging ngala kangi thigi du san chi dungi chambu da te rashi ma chung do ra tel ha ba toni ga lo san to chama nganzo lo ba tum ba ji re ma to pai yu ngala rashi gi tu pa chi yo ma re sang de ga le be to khora shi tu ye tende do tanda nganzo shi tu mu da mi ji zik tu bu ji la na ngazo le pen nugo do ra ine zik de drazam re ngazo de same ge suni an tando chichene kola ba sugar do sigre chichene khunje jenge ni ma ji kola takta zog san ine ngazo khare draji re ra zik da tubu khare la yene che dongo do la yena ra ti zik de la ngazo jusa chen pe ngazo ge nalo la khalo da kara ji ngaji ge ren zan shegda ra ye ko 저 동고라는 찌디기 도메 바이나 동고라 라와 삼지기 먼저 들려 힌칼라 다 동부들 저투다 라 아니 signa보지 라와이나 메라 타와인다 간지 먼저 들려냐 안 디가라 아니 파콘레 로야다 사나 마부다 강이 마부 소와라 티 계시 먼저 하고는 아게 개 말이 티 드라samre 티 파자가나 데마요 말고 다 버란시 지투바지 요 말에서 근데 사나 남사 가서 레라보 강이 튀기면다 라 tela deba na ko ngati la son la diga sana yang tang de na kangi pe chimbu cha do da
Now, with this understanding of the Four Noble Truths, we must now come back to how to relate this with the wisdom of emptiness. Now, immediately, if we are to talk about realizing emptiness, then maybe it's a little bit far-fetched. So, as such, it is important first to look at our experience and the manner in which our experience is filtered through and shaped by that conception of the self. Yes, all of our experiences are in effect shaped by and filtered through that conception of the self. So now, if we hold this self to be something absolute, something inherent, then look at the manner in which we try to cherish it, we try to protect its security, we try to secure everything we do. Everything we do, in effect, is to ensure the security of this sense of the self, is to protect this sense of the self. So far as when we look at our reactions to, for example, form, sound, and so forth. So when we look at these sensory objects, because our experiences are filtered through that conception of the self, then we begin to identify with outer objects as either serving the self, so as such pleasurable, not serving the self, so as such unpleasurable. So similarly, something harmless as a form, right? A sensory object, something harmless as a form, appears unpleasant to us because it doesn't serve the self at point, right? Then something that the self enjoys, pleasant, pleasurable. Now look at the experience, how the experience itself of pleasure and pain is dictated by the manner in which we relate to the self and the manner in which we relate the object to the self, right? All our experiences of pain, pleasure is in fact shaped by that conception of the self. We do realize this now. For example, someone utters a harsh word towards you. Someone looks at you a little bit weirdly. what happens at that moment? He is looking or she is looking at me strangely, me. That's exactly the sense of the self that's not enjoying it, right? So similarly, now as opposed to that, if we are able to realize that this sense of the self we hold to be absolute, intrinsic, having intrinsic nature, if we begin to appreciate the fact that this self is not intrinsically existent, so as such it's pointless to try to superimpose an existence onto this self, to project an existence onto this self, then what happens to the experience? It is no longer filtered through that grasping at the self anymore. Now you look at objects as simply the object itself is intrinsically not, it does not have intrinsic nature as such. So as such, you wouldn't fix a fundamental identity, a fundamental value, a fundamental meaning onto the object that shapes your experience at that point. So through that kind of contemplation, you begin to realize that there is a possibility wherein our experiences does not necessarily have to be shaped, influenced, and filtered through that conception of the self. And now this relates not only to the self, it relates also to the object itself too. So when we look at the self as lacking any intrinsic nature and the object also lacking intrinsic nature, then we do not project our fears, hopes, expectation onto situations anymore. We are able to, even if someone utters a harsh word, we look at it simply as a sound, yes, without projecting any hope, fear, meaning onto it. That is just a sound. It's intrinsically, it doesn't have intrinsic nature of being hurtful. It does not have any intrinsic nature of harming me. So with this kind of contemplation, you are able to reshape your experiences and through that reframe your responses to setbacks and challenges.
Wouldn't it be easy for us to use this to actually protect ourselves? Like, wouldn't it be very easy to use these, like whatever you said, it doesn't have intrinsic values, it's just a sound to protect against oneself. So wouldn't again it be just a cycle of that self-cherishing attitude?
Dini soso sungye la yora chigi yoro was de nganzo ge dembar maduba re la samla tang na yansra ta yin nganzo ge ta di dembar duba zingi yore sra ta zin de la tene ta de la sungjob che thapsi chigi yoras dembar maduba la ye jora de ni tai korne yora tama de la yan da zin tharang la sungjob che che tumare bes
danzi thama dad maduba di
ta do maduba ti yansra ta soso la ni dungye nyongye dugyo mare la jora de che do ni dembar duba ta yo mare dembar maduba re la di ta sungjob che che do re bes
dada pena tanda khoi khalas dala kangi dugum tambu chile ma di khala
dal ka ni dugyo marwas che za ni dazin de gil ten ni dag de chebar zing yo ras dag de shu sungjob che ta ji chi yo ras di che za ni nyomong ra ni jula so ba chu jo ras ta tena sing anzo gi da dembar maduba
la one thamadla so kanda ma da sungjo che che dada mare ta khandi kanji khalas na da sungjo che pha sha shi de demba maduba ha ko na sungjo che de goba me ba ko ra nga shi sung de ro sungya gi shi ko mindo samne tinga do tin do 가서 빼지는 게 통스 엔데로
다랑
그 시tor 쉐그라 파기 가서 다는 가라네 짜와치면 젠데니다 젠세기 시거로 tor셔 되니 베트 카르다.
So there is a difference if you think carefully about it. Now if we are being very blunt, then if the very locus of objectification, the very locus of conceptualization itself is dissolved, yeah, the objectification of the self itself is dissolved, then what self are you going to secure? What self are you going to protect? Yes? Huh? Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah, like it makes sense, but not able to imagine. But I can understand.
If the very conception of the self is destroyed, then what self exactly are you going to protect? What self would you bother to protect? So look at the manner in which the response, where the response comes from an understanding of lack of conception of self and a grasping at a self. Okay? So all our actions, when it comes from grasping at the self, comes from wanting to protect that self. Yes? Wanting to protect that self as something absolute, intrinsic, Because if it is intrinsic as we imagine it to be, then it would not be subject to experience itself. It would not be subject to outer causes and conditions itself. But since this is not the case, then we have to extend so much energy, so much effort to ensure that conception, even though it is wrong, it still holds. That's the manner in which our afflictions and actions come as a form of response. Now, as opposed to that, when you have the understanding of lack of intrinsic nature of the self, you wouldn't have to bother to hold this view that the self must not be subject to causes and conditions. So as such, there is no resistance to the experience itself. If there is a resistance to the experience, then of course there is already the experience of pain and pleasure. But if there is no resistance to the experience itself, then it is as it is.
Can you share how to reconcile what you're sharing right now about recognizing the conception of self and how once that is recognized, there is no self to be hurt?
That's only recognizing it. We still haven't worked towards overcoming it.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. So maybe I'm leaping ahead, but I'm imagining recognizing and overcoming the sense of self and reconciling that with the discussion yesterday and the practical advice to remove oneself from harmful situations and harmful people.
Tadilagar. Tananganzugi ani ta kabdulana gajang unzin lagyora. Ani ta Dharmadatu dik nganzu gajara da. Ani kisi dedawe ani gaja dingwe zinasra. Ani nganzugi khasang ani Geshema lagi lapso lamde nangdu zamba ani kisi suso la nutse dawo dinde pogi du samsamra chunasra. Suso nutse dinde ta rings deya. Dinde sungro asra. Didan dingi ta genda do chagyo marabes. Gajangwe ziyan jidansra. Ani tanda nganzugi nutse da chunas. Sutaring deore la jora.
Pena chirang la miji gi chirang gi daro ji gi chirang la chi shuro china. Ra. Kesi chirang thudo na chana la kesa raida. Ra. Tanda gajang ngonzela indigala yu ngola madu baji kesi thuwa ina dinde thugu rele. Ra. Pena yu pena nganzugi ta demba chirang gi chirang demba thuyo mala. Kesi thuwa ina dinde ji thugu rele. Thutse ji sha. Tala gasha ngonzela di pa kaya de kesi yo mares. Yo na dinde ji yo gu resle. Ti khagara ji reda.
So now these two we need to understand it in their proper context first. When we are talking about the conception of the self as an object of negation, we are effectively not putting the self on trial. This is not what we are doing. We are saying that, okay, there is a conception of the self. Yes? So as such, a conception has an object. Yes? And object of the conception of the self. Now we are looking at whether the object of the conception of the self is a self, but does it exist intrinsically as it is conceived to be? This is the inquiry, this is the investigation here. Now as opposed to that, when we are talking about removing ourselves from sources of harm, then this is in relation with a conventional self that still experiences harm and so forth.
Ye chuzula ma tuwaj tuwa. Pena nga tado la jan, rensen la jan, control la jan. Ti kandis chegi dura. Ti bu la, ti che goya jinse khar rojdu. Ti samtan ti pensa de samsust.
Now maybe it's my turn to ask you a question. When all of us have experienced jealousy, all of us have experiences,
Dancing.
competitiveness, a sense of competition,
아니 차도.
comparing ourselves with others.
아들 lesson 아니 control.
Then anger. So,
그래서 지구에 있어서 진짜로 저라. 간대로 저라.
and what motivates one to become jealous? What motivates one to become competitive with others? To compare ourselves with others? What motivates us to become angry?
I want to get this. I like this, so you're taking it, so it's mine.
ngale din legi yoris.
근데 미질 차도서나. jealousy 잖아. 라. 코에 토르디 토우잖아 그 가음다. 가서 나 뒤되냐. 나 쳐디거다. 나 코다 다음도. 코에 토르지나 코 가진 놈에 토 가지지 아지는 거. 되는 거 줄지다 이게 편하게 겸다. 이내 믹싱 시켜서다. 코야 보잖아. 마가시. 뒤가서나 나 코다 냠바 차도 코 나래 토르라. 댄싱 되는 거지라. 컨트롤. 라. 심바 가르래. 심바 컨트롤.
So when we look at the manner in which we become jealous, then when we look at what exactly motivates us to become jealous, then we understand that it is a form of reaction to an experience, wherein we look at someone who is doing really well, then we become jealous when we see them. And why exactly do we become jealous? Because I should be like him.
나 아니 컨트롤 안돼 가르 컨트롤.
Then similarly, look at the experience of anger. What really motivates us to become angry? Huh?
How could you do this to me? That's
ngala dinde chugi khandes che logo che song samsang gi control line.
nga dina sunjo chida ngala kharchi jera ngala ladi ngade chetu tusa tso de ngaran sang ngal thudio ra ani shimba konzo shimba lani
Anyone else? Yes.
Yeah.
So, it's similar to this question. So, when
We are first answering this question Geshema asked. We are answering the question that Geshema asked. She wants to hear from you. She wants to hear from all of you. Look at the moment when you become jealous, angry, competitive. What exactly motivates you in these moments? Fear. Shenang.
kharchini shinale or
Why exactly is there fear? At risk? No.
competitive sabjire
Not that deep. We're just looking at our experience. We're not exactly, because I get hurt, because I might get hurt.
저는 그냥 이미지를 차도 지나 차도 가르친 치고 그야지 가지도나도 최대로 막아야 가르친 치고 어디 사는시다.
So think about it in this manner. If you become jealous of someone else, then why exactly do you become jealous of someone doing well? Right? Because you becoming jealous of that person doesn't really affect the progress, development of that person at all. But still, you look at that, but still you feel jealous. Why exactly do you feel jealous? Shindala yujuji ngala mindu.
ngala mindulara 신다지도 ngala mindu ngada kun 냠도 차기 mindu ngate 마요 코야 토르 티버로 ngada 마가자 진짜 그 가지 토는 또 개문도 오케이 I don't care 가지 던더라 인해 가서 ngada kun 냠고 문들라네 ngati 버로 쳐드다 난 컨트롤실라나 테라 nga sungcho chigo ngala nakpo jila sungula ra tiladiga tanga kola chik magawa susu yang control pa ra chik nakpo jila nga so control lang do migi tadang duja sitanare chik zubo jila nare kerana tes mandi waji chewo ndigala nga to control sayunda hasana nga tsawa chimbo tsudidigala ngala tin chena namsa nga to di 포로다 nga to hakuda chona misholo wanda miji milo sitana china chola keku chiyo mare ma soyo mare 그러니까 준호 초요 말에 니 밀로시다와이나 ngazu milo ta samji söguma ngazu tamza ngana sunje chego ngazu hago ma ra o ko ngala milo ta khare ni soso sunje shu chigida ta je shune de yin ba che sikzubul a ko ngala sikzubul ta tsidu ngazu la po ne ma so do de che min da ine ngazu tigli dalan jin ko ngala de de la so amma de han sa ra ngara zo nam to ye cher tang tene be do ko lu no ani pa ndam laida ti tsama khala na shebula tingle ngara ngayor.
So we are trying to appreciate this experientially when we say that all our experiences become shaped and filtered through that conception of the I. Now it becomes apparent when we begin to look at our own experiences of jealousy, anger, and so forth, that all these experiences, all these emotions, in effect, come from that I. And the I is always at the center of these experiences. And it shapes, it inspires, it gives rise to these experiences. Because when you become jealous, I am no longer equal to them. He has more than me. He is better than me now. Similarly, when you become angry, oh, how dare he say something like that to me? How dare he cast such a look at me? Yeah? People roll your eyes at you, people look at you weirdly, then that doesn't really have any effect on the I at all. But still we have a reaction because we hold this I to be something very dear to ourselves. We cherish it, right? But it doesn't have any effect if we think about it. But our reaction is prompted by this I. So similarly, now these are like harmless things. But these harmless things give rise to other more grave sources of harm.
Kesi tombanyi ndo tashi tawa hamagwana ngana zon doyonga jil jude mura nganzugi mi ya potongo do ani mi zura mi zule ya potongo ya ra nawe gi dra bo ko ga ani nagi tishin bo ko ga ngazu sen so ani chida ani kage ani de kala towa yu shimbo saga ra ani lula nganzu tolu chubo do dan jigim na jambo ya bo goda 세상은 참 내용이 이제 주대 차대. 세상은 뒤창만 제부를 나가에 손제라. 나라 두자 되기면 나라 신부마도 나라디 지게 마시모 되기면 나라 드람 많이만 되기면 나라 줌만저 참만 나도 참한테 주대 내용이 이제 파추된다.
Now, if we cannot appreciate emptiness, if we cannot understand emptiness effectively, then it's perfectly okay to think about it in this manner, that we are mindlessly running after sensory objects all the time. We only want to hear beautiful sounds. We only want to see beautiful forms. We only want to eat tasty food. We only want to smell nice smells. We only want to feel good, smooth textures. That's about the extent of our concerns most of the time. Yeah.
The last question.
That is cherishing the I.
That was the big question. 다 뭐이 되어야 되요. 먼저기 닭 진진이 나줘라. 되니 닭 코랑 기스라. 닭 코랑 집어 증겨를 배스. 닭 진진 집어 증켄지 거러 왔다. 디 증켄 디 진석이 유디 거랑 타제. 증켄기 안 타지에 거러 왔어.
다다 덴버투서 조만 다 마타 마치비 nga지 도 티긴센데 거라. 마타 바지디 타니 데비 다주라. 티긴센데 강이 디소 거라. 이네야 딘데 다데야 파잉올라 다 덴버투버지라네 요마. 와 마타 마치비 nga지 자지 테데니 깨지 시데니 로데니 사데니 미치도. 데파 덴버투버요라네 요마레. 이네야 디기 가르치고라나 다 제반 젠거.
So the object, the self that is being cherished, is a self that does not exist. But the self that is cherishing that self, that the subject which cherishes the object, the self, distinction. Okay? The object is non-existent, but the subject is a conventionally existent self. A conventionally existent self, a term self, a term self, okay? But the object, the intrinsically existent self that we cherish, is non-existent. conventionally. We just put a term on it, self, which experiences this. Okay? No, both are not intrinsically. Both are, one is intrinsic, one we hold to be intrinsically existent. That is the object that we cherish, an absolute self. Yeah, that we cherish. That conventionally existent self, the one who walks about, eats, drinks, performs the function of a self. Lacking intrinsic nature. Lacking intrinsic nature. Yes. Yes, it both lacking intrinsic nature, but we hold the object to have intrinsic nature. See the difference? Both, a cup conventionally lacks intrinsic nature, ultimately also lacks intrinsic nature. Right? This is true. But we hold the cup to have intrinsic nature. Though similarly, the I that we cherish, we hold it to have some absolute existence. But the self which experiences this, cherishes it, is actually a conventionally existent self, lacking all intrinsic nature. Should we stop here now? We stop here, okay?